The U.S. agricultural sector has been hit by countless challenges over the past century, but very few moments have felt as dramatic, as severe, and as historically significant as the collapse of U.S. corn exports in recent months. For decades, the United States has been considered the breadbasket of the world, dominating global grain markets and serving as a reliable supplier for countries that depended on its harvests. Corn, in particular, stood as the crown jewel of American agriculture. It was not only the backbone of U.S. farming but also a pillar of global trade, used in livestock feed, processed foods, ethanol production, and countless industrial applications. But the sudden collapse of exports by a staggering 94% has shocked both farmers at home and trade partners abroad, raising urgent questions about how such a collapse happened, what it means for America's farmers, and how the global food system will adjust to the absence of the world's largest corn exporter. To fully grasp the magnitude of this collapse, one must first understand the scale at which the U.S. corn industry has historically operated. In a typical year, American farmers plant tens of millions of acres of corn, producing billions of bushels that not only supply domestic consumption but also sustain a massive export industry. Countries from Mexico to Japan, from South Korea to Colombia, have long relied on U.S. corn as a stable, affordable, and dependable import. Export contracts worth billions of dollars kept the American heartland afloat, with small-town economies depending on grain elevators, transport companies, and shipping routes to keep farmers' livelihoods viable. When news broke that U.S. corn exports had effectively collapsed, with volumes wiped out by over 90%, the ripple effect went beyond economics. It was felt in the desperation of farmers, the volatility of global commodity markets, and the geopolitical recalibration of trade alliances. Farmers in the Midwest, particularly in states like Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, and Minnesota, were stunned. Many had already been struggling with fluctuating input costs, including fertilizer and fuel, both of which had risen sharply over the past 3 years. Weather volatility had also become a factor, with unpredictable droughts, floods, and shifting growing seasons making planting and harvest schedules harder to predict. But while these challenges had strained farmers, they could still manage to get their crops to market. What no one saw coming was the dramatic drop-off in international demand for U.S. corn, triggered by a combination of economic, political, and environmental forces converging at once. A key driver of the collapse has been the rise of aggressive competition from other exporters. Brazil, in particular, has surged to the forefront as a corn powerhouse. With vast agricultural land, lower labor costs, and increasingly efficient production methods, Brazil has expanded its corn output at a record pace. Coupled with favorable weather conditions and government policies that encourage exports, Brazil has managed to flood global markets with cheaper corn, displacing U.S. shipments in markets where cost-sensitive buyers dominate. Meanwhile, Argentina and Ukraine, despite their own internal challenges, have also played roles in reshaping trade flows, offering competitive prices that undercut American offers. Another critical factor has been the deterioration of U.S. trade relations with key partners. Over the past decade, a series of disputes, tariffs, and political tensions have made some importers wary of relying too heavily on U.S. agricultural goods. Countries like China, once among the largest buyers of U.S. corn, have diversified their import sources, striking long-term contracts with Brazil and other producers. In doing so, they have reduced their dependency on the United States, leaving American farmers vulnerable to sudden demand shocks. The result has been a hollowing out of export contracts that once felt ironclad, leaving silos full of unsold grain and farm families wondering how they would make ends meet. The collapse has also been compounded by logistical bottlenecks and infrastructure problems. In recent years, the U.S. river system, particularly the Mississippi, has faced record-low water levels due to drought conditions. Barges, which are the lifeline of bulk grain transport from the Midwest to export terminals in the Gulf of Mexico, have struggled to operate efficiently, leading to backups, higher freight costs, and slower delivery times. Foreign buyers, seeing these issues, have turned toward more reliable suppliers, further accelerating the decline in U.S. exports. Rail systems, too, have faced capacity issues, with freight congestion driving costs higher at precisely the moment when American grain needed to stay competitive. For farmers, the consequences have been devastating. Many had taken on loans in anticipation of steady export revenues, only to find themselves unable to move their crops abroad. Grain bins across the Midwest have been filled to capacity, and prices at local elevators have plummeted as oversupply crushes margins. Farmers who once counted on export demand to stabilize prices now face the prospect of selling their corn at losses, threatening the financial survival of family farms passed down for generations. Bankruptcies in the agricultural sector are beginning to rise, farm equipment purchases have stalled, and rural communities are bracing for an economic downturn that could rival previous crises. The collapse of exports is not only a domestic issue, it is also reshaping global food security. For decades, importing nations relied on the United States to act as a stabilizer in times of shortage. American grain served as an anchor in global trade, ensuring that even when supplies tightened elsewhere, there was always a reliable fallback. With U.S. exports evaporating, that safety net is gone. Countries that once depended on American corn are now scrambling to secure alternatives, bidding up prices in global markets and creating new volatility that threatens food security for poorer nations. While wealthier importers may be able to absorb the cost of higher prices, vulnerable populations in developing countries face rising risks of food inflation, shortages, and instability. The political ramifications are equally significant. U.S. policymakers, long accustomed to using agricultural exports as a tool of diplomacy, now find themselves losing influence. Grain deals that once cemented strategic partnerships are being rewritten without the U.S. at the table. Competitors like Brazil are seizing the moment to strengthen ties with countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, expanding their influence and reshaping global agricultural alliances. For Washington, the collapse of corn exports represents not just an economic crisis but also a loss of soft power on the global stage. Some analysts argue that the collapse was inevitable, pointing out that the U.S. had grown complacent in its position as the world's dominant exporter. Years of underinvestment in infrastructure, combined with rising production costs and environmental challenges, eroded competitiveness. Others insist that policy missteps, particularly in trade negotiations, accelerated the decline. Still, others point to larger structural shifts in the global economy, such as the rise of renewable energy alternatives reducing demand for corn-based ethanol, as part of the reason exports have withered. Whatever the cause, the result is clear. The American corn industry is facing a reckoning unlike any it has seen before. Farmers and trade groups are now demanding urgent action. Proposals range from direct government support to offset losses, to massive infrastructure investments designed to modernize transport systems and restore competitiveness. There are also calls for a renewed focus on diversifying markets, seeking out smaller importers who might still be open to U.S. grain. Yet even with such measures, few believe the export market can be restored to its former size anytime soon. Too many contracts have already been lost, too many buyers have shifted their supply chains, and too many competitors are entrenched. The collapse may not be a temporary setback, but rather a permanent reset of America's role in global agriculture. Amid this turmoil, the resilience of farmers is being tested. Stories are emerging of families selling off equipment, leasing out land, or seeking second jobs just to survive. Communities that once thrived on